Hey guys, we continue today looking at the Age of Revolutions, and our second part is all of the bad stuff. The age of Napoleon, the end perhaps of the revolution, but yet at the exact same time, the spread of these revolutionary ideals all across the globe. So here we are, the Age of Revolutions, part two, the Age of Napoleon and global revolutions. And before we actually start, this is actually a time for you to go ahead and pause the video and actually answer two background questions from our previous activity dealing with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So what you're going to do is to go ahead and access these two questions in your Google Classroom document and answer number 1 and 2 in that document. Okay? So you may have to do some review, may have to go back to a previous document, but either way, answers numbers 1 and 2 in the document provided. So pause the video before we move on. All right. So with that, all of these rights and liberties were promised as a result of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But these ideas, as it turns out, were way, way too revolutionary for the conservatives of Europe all across it. And in a lot of ways, they crossed many different lines, not only with these ideas, but also with the violence that it took to gain these particular ideas. And if you watched the video, you saw the almost the unrestricted violence that the revolutionaries utilized in to secure these rights and liberties that they, in the end, ended up giving up or at least temporarily halting in order to secure their new position. And so, in a lot of ways, the French Revolution is described by this quote here: a time when half of Europe was intoxicated by these ideas, and the other half completely terrified by the new magic of the world citizen and this new identity of people with individual rights and liberties. In a lot of ways, things that we understand and grow up with today. But many historians will look at the French Revolution as a complete and utter failure because, in some ways, it begins with the absolute monarchy of King Louis XVI. Okay, became an absolute monarch with the passage of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a constitutional monarch, and eventually was executed for potentially being a traitor to the French state. Okay, and for a short amount of time, from being a limited monarch, France was a republic. But in name, because in reality, it is the Committee for Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, who was featured in the film, who became not just the leader of the Jacobins, but the most powerful man on the Committee for Public Safety. I always think of this as one of the worst historical titles, right? This group that will execute thousands, being named the Committee for Public Safety of all things here. And Robespierre, who will eventually, throughout his threats, be executed himself. And as a result of this, the Republic ends up losing power to this small committee known as the Directory. Okay? And throughout the 1790s, France would survive, but in terms of revolutionary ideas, they continue to be threatened, and France doesn't go anywhere throughout the 1790s. That is until the seizure of power by one of the key generals of securing revolutionary France, and that would be Napoleon, who will find himself as emperor. And so, if we go back to our previous lecture outline, we've looked at how the world itself, because of globalization, is changing, okay, and how one of the key essential places whereby these changes are occurring was in this new American, and really for the first time, a successful republic. The attempt to do so in France opened up these ideas, but yet at the exact same time, they reverted back to a type of dictatorship. But even then, Napoleon did things, one, that threatened revolutionary ideas, but yet at the exact same time also secured revolutionary ideas as well. So it's worthwhile to take a look at Napoleon, the little man on the horse. Now, if you've never heard of what is known as the Napoleon complex, it's this notion, and you probably know a person like that, that little guy, right, who is larger than life, always speaks louder than everybody else in the room, does things that really puts attention on himself here. Hey, we all know a person like that. Someone who's acts bigger than their size. And again, the name comes from Napoleon himself. Someone who was not necessarily tiny, but smaller than the average man, but really acted like someone who was much, much grander than before. That's where the title comes from. But a little bit background on Napoleon, just because he's an interesting character. He's not from the Third Estate. He is a minor noble, albeit from a region of France, actually off the Italian coast, and really wasn't a large house by any means, but it gave him enough pull to become to get access to the French military school. And as it turns out, he had a skill for commanding. The revolution does allow for individuals of skill to rise up in ranks at this time. And so he became a general, a brigadier general by the age of 24, and was eventually, by the 1790s, given some command over a army in Italy and Austria. And in both cases, he took outnumbered armies and defeated armies a much larger size than he possessed. And so many of the tactics that he used in these battles would be studied in many of these military schools. And as a result, his popularity soared. Okay? And to the point where he even sent a military expedition to British controlled Egypt at this time. And it actually failed. And he lost an army in North Africa. But yet, at the exact same time, his popularity continued to grow throughout the 1790s, despite the failure of this particular campaign. Because of success, members of the Directory decided to bring him on board, hoping to monopolize his popularity to secure their rule. As it turned out, Napoleon wasn't just simply an adept general, but then also an adept politician as well. He's able to overthrow the other members of the Directory, and by the age 30, he became a consul, which is sort of like a chief executive position, something that we would have as a president, for instance. He imposed a new constitution. Using his popularity, had the French people select him through an election, what is called a plebiscite, and as a result, became the consul for life as a result of this somewhat democratic French action in 1802. And as the ruler of France, what he does is he does a number of things. One, he goes to the Catholic Church and basically apologizes for all the atrocities that had been done by the revolutionaries to the church in eliminating the Christian calendar, in executing priests, taking away church lands and others. He goes to the Pope and says, "Hey, like most rulers of the past, he realized, hey, you know what? You need me as much as I need you." And so there was an agreement between the Pope and now really the ruler of much of Europe. But this concorded with the Pope had some limitations, one of which is that church lands that were seized by the French government would retain in the possession of the French government. The government also volunteered to pay the salary of priests. Now, you might think that, oh, that's really nice, but in a sense, this is all about power and control. And in doing so, the local French priests now would therefore be instruments of the French state. And also at the exact same time, there was the allowance of freedom of religion. And this particularly is uh, beneficial for the Protestants and Jews that have been persecuted during this particular time period. Not only that, but Napoleon, as what many historians would call an enlightened despot. In other words, they're read in on the ideas of the Enlightenment about rational rule and rights of man and so forth. And so they're going to act to preserve some of these particular rights. And so what he establishes in 1804 is this document called the Napoleonic Code, and whereby there were guarantees very similar to the Declaration of the Rights of Man of liberty, of a uniform law for all. So we talk about a big change between the estate system in France and what he's trying to create, whereby it becomes a more classless society. The notion of uniform law is really essential and something that the Third Estate particularly pursued at this time. And there's also rights for protection of private property, the creation of a merit-based bureaucracy so that you're not just paying members of the Second Estate, right, the sons of the nobility, giving them title and because they're the son of some lord or whatnot. So a merit-based bureaucracy in order to gain government positions, and really, if you're going to have democratic style institutions, the creation of public education institutions. This 1904 Napoleonic Code, which you're actually going to look at. Um, in just a little bit will be essential for the creation of many legal codes in the various states all across Europe. Now is also the second time to go ahead and pause the video, because what you're going to do now is to evaluate the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Code as well. Okay, so if you could pause the video, go back to the Google document and go and answers number 3 through 7 using the documents that are provided in the PDF. So it's going to take a little bit of time. So this is the big break within the lecture, where really it's going to break up into two here. So once we get the Napoleonic Code, go ahead and answers number 3 through 7. So pause the video right now. All right, guys, I'm glad you guys are back. So we left off here, and hopefully you've examined parts of the Napoleonic Code, how in some ways, yes, it's going to secure some of the rights of the revolution, but yet at the exact same ways, it's going to bring back some of the past. Okay? And what really looks like the old days of an absolute king and monarch is one, the eventual declaration of Napoleon as emperor, so not just as consul, someone's elected into office by the people, but fearing that he may be assassinated at any point, he decides he's going to have himself and his wife Josephine crowned as emperor and empress. In other words, it would be like a hereditary monarchy. And so, as a result of this, we come back full circle and we're really creating that hereditary monarchy once again. The establishment of things like censorship of the press, which happened frequently under the king, and the creation of a secret police to ensure that his edicts would become law and that there would be no rebellion against him, even though there were plenty. Okay, so hopefully you've done number 7. What changes, not just in terms of just, hey, okay, here is these dramatic changes in France, is that Napoleon utilizes the notion of the world, of the French citizen, okay, and he creates as a result an enormous army of conscripts, of citizen soldiers, people who say, look, uh, if you're part of our state, you should serve in the military as well. And so all of a sudden now the French army moves into the hundreds of thousands in size. And so using this particular army, and also through his particular skill, what Napoleon's able to do is to conquer most of the Iberian Peninsula, which is in this case here the kingdoms of Spain, and would invade Portugal, but wouldn't be successful in doing so. But also states like Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands next door, and parts of Prussia right here. Again, here's Austria, and all of these empires will be challenged as a result of this. The defeat of Austria and Prussia forced both of them into Napoleon's empire as into a forced alliance, and Napoleon decides that the last major continental power that really was in resistance to him happens to be Russia. But hey, in a combination of Russian bravery and particularly tactics, what we call scorched earth tactics, means that Napoleon's army advanced deep into Russia, but eventually found themselves in the midst of winter. Never invade Russia in the winter. Okay. In 1812, and really the army would diminish in size, not just in combat, but in terms of the weather, in terms of the lack of food and resources. So this grand army of about 600,000 to begin with, here's the size here, invading Russia, find themselves in Moscow only to retreat. And with every week, the numbers of deaths, casualties, and desertions will increase, so much so that only about 60,000 remained. This became the situation that allowed for the various allied armies to turn against Napoleon. And as a result of this, they won a major battle in 1814, forcing Napoleon to abdicate the throne, meaning that he would leave the French as the key executive. Now, they're wary. Now, you would imagine someone who's caused this much trouble, like Napoleon, creating a decades long war, may get executed in some ways, but not this group. This group's going to do something a little bit different. I'll explain that in just a little bit here. But either way, Napoleon gets exiled to an island off the coast in the Mediterranean in Elba. He hears about some major changes that are going about in France and all of Europe, but he's stuck there. He's by law supposed to remain there. But he starts to hear rumblings within France that people are, they're not keen on the new king and they're not keen on the new government that's going on. And Napoleon takes a risk. He jumps on a boat with some of his key compatriots and he sails for France, basically escapes his exile. Now, as he lands in southern France, he should be arrested and at this point executed for resisting the law. But as it turns out, people come to greet him, and they start to see him as potentially their rescuer from this um, system that is being enacted. And so, as he marches through France, many of his former officers come back to him and they raise up another army. And oh, here we go. After about a decade plus of war, Napoleon is going to be at it again. Another coalition army is created by the British and the Prussians. They meet Napoleon on the battlefield in this Belgian town called outside the town of Waterloo. It's a tight battle. It could have gone either way, and it turns out Napoleon is defeated. This time he is exiled to the island of St. Helena, which is way far out in the Atlantic, not a place where you just take a boat and find yourself back in Europe. Writes his memoirs and eventually passes away in 1821. But sometimes one man can have an enormous impact on the rest of the globe. And so there are a number of aftershocks, okay, global aftershocks, that will change the notion of the globe. These ideas that have come out of the Enlightenment, of liberalism, okay, that we can govern ourselves and and to vouch for individual freedoms, that we don't belong to another person or class or group, that there should be no classes. And not only that, but we are good enough, according to the ideas of Locke and others, to govern ourselves, popular sovereignty. All of these ideas were spread throughout not only Napoleon's empire, but then also as they conquer Spain and others, also their colonies as well. And what it's going to lead to all throughout Europe and the Americas are a number of these nationalist movements, a push to create new independent nation states based upon all of these values and ideals. But yet, at the exact same time, there are those who looked at this and said, no, 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 we can't have this. All of this needs to be eliminated as soon as possible by a conservative counter revolution who said, absolutely not to this here. Okay? So if you could, before we move on to this last point, okay, we're going to take a look at question 8. So go back to your Google document, okay, and do this quick review here. Which groups dominated pre-revolutionary France? Take a moment, pause the video, and answer these questions. All right, guys, glad you guys are back. Hopefully you've answered number 8 in a lot of ways is answered by this next slide here. Okay. The counter-revolution. So the French Revolution is creating a dramatic change to society. Those who want to revert back to this are counter-revolutionaries. So particularly, hopefully you can see this, groups like the Catholic Church, okay, the nobility, the ancient monarchies, the monarchies that have seized power for hundreds of years, they are interested in keeping things as they were, despite all these changes. Now, you can't put the cat back now that the cat's out of the house, right? So, as a result of this, they wanted to preserve as much as they possibly can. So, many of the officials, after Napoleon's defeat in 1814, this is prior to Waterloo, by the way, came together with what they called the Concert of Europe, where aim number one is that now they could have punished France for all they had done, but instead, they restored the royal family. So the brother of King Louis XVI was brought back, and he became now the constitutional monarch of France, King Louis XVII in 1814. So instead of punishing France, they rewarded them back with a monarch because they said, look, France is too critical, right? Because it's not as if we need to preserve the state, it's the notion and tradition of the monarchy that they're trying to secure. And so, aim number one, secure the royals as best they can, secure France as a bastion of these traditional ideas. And not only that, but they're afraid that if another Napoleon starts to come into play here, that they would start a giant continental war. So they're going to create an alliance system that they're going to try more or less to preserve to try to prevent another continental war. Now, this is going to be really important for our next unit. They're going to create a system of balance of powers. Okay? Two sides always that will be more or less balanced to one another, no matter what their ideology, political beliefs, and so forth, to prevent another giant continental war like we saw under Napoleon. Okay? That's their aim. Okay? Were they successful? Okay? Again, it's hard to put things, once you open Pandora's box, you can't put it back in. These ideas are out. And so throughout the 19th century, okay, there are numbers of attempts to create more and greater liberal societies, more freedom. So every time hey, freedoms are taken away, groups are going to try to bring them back again. So those, some of you guys have watched the play, musical, read the book, seen the movie Les Miserables, right? That itself is about a student movement to try to create a greater democratic institutions in France um, beyond just simply the French Revolution. So a number of these are occurring. Some of the key dates include 1830. One of the biggest dates is 1848, where there are revolutions to happen all across Europe to try to enact these democratic liberal ideas. And eventually, many of these would be crushed. A lot of Germans will try to get this. So many of them ended up emigrating to the United States at this point. That might actually be your great, 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 great grandfather who did that. Okay. So these are the counter revolutions to the ideas, the continuities, if you want to look at it that way. But they could not stop at all. And so there are a number of European nationalist movements that were enacted at this time, including the Greeks, which was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And Europeans really fell in love with the idea because if you think back, hey, Athens is the home of, you can probably fill in the blank, the home of democracy. Okay? And so Greek independence from the Ottomans. There are other nationalist movements that come out at this time here, including Belgian independence, Catholic Belgian independence from Protestant Netherlands. And not only that, but this notion of the breaking of these key classes of the first and the second estate means that there was a greater push to end serfdom, right? Really the core of the old feudal society from in Eastern Europe and in particularly in Russia, and then also a number of nationalist movements in Central Europe that these big multi-ethnic empires like Prussia and Austria are going to try to suppress as much as they possibly can. Okay, so we get to our next review question. So again, another time to go ahead and pause the video and answer this here as we look at this globally. So the next review question is this: what were the major export crops and goods from the Americas? In other words, what goods are being taken, grown in the Americas and sent to the rest of the world? And also a question of how these crops and goods were produced. So go ahead and pause the video right now. All right, we're back. Okay, so once you've answered number nine, hey, it's will set up the context, hey, to answer, to examine really a key global impact, and that's what happens in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, hey, what we know today as Haiti, okay, the country of Haiti. So in Saint-Domingue, a French colony, okay, a immense producer of, and hopefully you got this from a previous answer, this key export crop, okay, sugar, okay, which um, relied upon a slave labor from Africa, particularly. And so at the time of the French Revolution, there were three primary groups that lived in Haiti. Okay, the first of which was a small white population. Now, keep this in mind here. This population isn't the first or second estate. It's not the nobility that's living here. It's not the Roman Catholic clergy. Instead, these are members of the third estate, some of which are read in the Enlightenment ideas. And so, as the revolution is going on, these are the individuals who are proclaiming freedom and liberty and equality beyond the traditional class structure. All at the exact same time. They're residing in an island whereby there are about 30,000 gens de couleur. In other words, free blacks, many of which have either fought or have bought their manumission. Again, a key vocabulary word. You've bought your freedom from slavery, who live on the island as, in a lot of ways, second or third class citizen. And then beyond that are 500,000 hey, African slaves. Hey, and as these ideas regarding the French Revolution are spreading, hey, all of a sudden, hey, those who could read, some of the freed blacks and also just a handful of slaves, because it was illegal to do so, hey, started to find some of these ideas, and they are moving towards revolution. But it's not just simply about um, freedoms. There's also an inspiration from some religions as well, particularly one syncretic religion called voodoo. This combination of a Native American, traditional African, and Catholicism all sort of mixed into one here. One particular voodoo priest, a man by the name of Bokman, ends up calling for a massive slave uprising against the whites in Saint Domingue. And as a result of this, a few leaders cropped up to try to secure this rebellion and actually make it successful. One of which was a slave by the name of Toussaint Louverture, who was one of the few fortunate enough to be able to read and speak languages and connect with those not only slaves but then also freed blacks and also the whites who had actually helped him get his education and other things as well. So he became a natural leader who eventually helped the Haitians to defeat the white elite on the island. A British a strike force that was sent to try to seize the island during the Napoleonic Wars, an attempt by Spain to try to free uh, the western half of the island. And not only that, when Napoleon tried to eventually retake the colony, he failed in doing so. Now, that's going to help us because Napoleon gives up on the Americas at this point, and he decides, you know what, I got to fund my wars. And so he sells it to Thomas Jefferson in what becomes known as the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. Unfortunately, Toussaint Louverture would be in some peace talks. He'd be arrested and eventually will die in jail. Others would take the mantle and create, in a lot of ways, the first egalitarian republic in all the world, whereby it doesn't matter what color of your skin, you are truly equals. It is unfortunate, though, because the United States would continue to a trade embargo against Haiti and will fail to recognize it as a state. And you could probably guess why. Haiti was created by a successful slave rebellion, whereby in an era where the American South particularly was keen on keeping their particular institution. And lastly, okay, before we get to the last part here, we want to take a look at and do some further review on this question right here as it moves to the rest of Spanish America. Explain the caste system, las castas. This is a key document we looked at in our previous unit. Explain what they were in Spanish America. So go ahead and pause the video right now. Okay. All right, guys, we're back. Okay. So with that, the last part. Okay. Napoleon conquers Spain. And at this point, Spain is struggling. They've spent too much money on these religious and six wars of succession. They've really thrown away all their silver. They've come in with all this money that never developed their economy. And so Spain is now, in a lot of ways, a second class power. And they're taken over by Napoleonic France. And Napoleon puts his brother on the throne of Spain. And this becomes a cue for particularly the Creoles, who are seen as second class citizens to the peninsulares. And not that these guys are in bad positions. They're oftentimes landowners, sometimes plantation owners, local elites in towns and cities, but they did not have all the rights of the peninsulares. And so they're using this opportunity to distance themselves from the Spanish crown and perhaps declare independence as well. And so as a result of this, many of the Creoles, Simon Bolivar, whose document we're going to read later on, Jose de San Martin in Argentina, and a commander by the name of O'Higgins in Chile. They are going to call for rebellion in various regions of South America. There are others who are attempting to do this. And it's not just simply Creoles, but then also groups of the other social classes as well, the mestizos, mulattoes, and slaves who are calling for greater autonomy, greater independence, and rights that they previously never had before. And so they're calling for independence, and oftentimes groups are actually fighting the Creoles during this revolutionary period. A great example of this happens to be in Mexico, where a priest by the name of Miguel Hidalgo calls for a revolution, leading indigenous Mayans, Amerindians, mestizos, inspired by um, a number of Catholic priests and saints were actually calling for independence against Spain. That eventually failed, and it turned to another Creole here who ends up formally declaring independence against Spain and winning in doing so. So, in many of these cases, unlike what we see in the American revolutions, whereby um, it's not just simply the landowners, but many independent farmers, landed yeoman farmers, middle class merchants, and others who are all part of the revolutionary process. Instead, in Latin America, in former Spain, it's the old elites, the Creoles, that will seize power, and they're going to join up with many of the big landowners as well to seize control of many of these governments as well. So that becomes an unfortunate point in Latin American independence, in that you replace one elite group with another. And when things don't work and when things don't function, you have military dictatorships that eventually seize power and take over. And that will become a trend in Latin America as well. Okay. Napoleon will invade Portugal as well. Portugal, which controlled Brazil, okay, ends up housing Portuguese royal family as they flee the possible threat of Napoleon. And in doing so, Brazil, after the threat of Napoleon is eliminated, they declare independence under one of the guidance of one of the Portuguese princes, Dom Pedro, who would create a new Brazil independent of Portugal, outside of a bloody revolution. But again, one way we can conclude this is that many of these Creoles, those who are born in Latin America, but in a lot of ways are some of the local elites, they will become many key landowners. A name for them are the caudillos, where they're going to continue, in some cases, slavery, and not all, to continue to support the power of the church, and will possess these enormous land holdings. And what we're going to see is oppression of the class. Well, some of these lower classes are going to get some rights. They're going to help to fight for independence. For instance, a lot of slaves will become free as a result of fighting for independence. eh, but many of these class struggles will continue, and they don't break apart like we see in other parts of Europe. Okay, so this ends the lecture for today. But we're going to continue this by examining some of the words and some of the challenges of the revolutionary movement in Latin America through the works of Simon Bolivar tomorrow. All right, guys, thanks for sticking around.